what I'd like to just ask for you is to hear me out and keep an open mind and never stop questioning. So I have a case that we mentioned. I diagnosed Ezra, 7 years old, with diabetes type 1 in August 2014. And the parents researched the LCHF diet, low-carb, high-fat diet, and they put Ezra onto quite a strict low-carb diet. And the aim was to maintain normal blood glucose levels, and they turned to me as their pediatrician for support. But I had this ethical dilemma because the pediatric endocrinologist definitely did not support it. That's when I turned to David, and he did not support it. I did a search of the clinical studies, and there's very little available, not much on safety, efficacy, and the parents were determined, despite my warnings, so I decided to go into a scientific inquiry and to look at what this LCHF diet is. So in searching for that, I found a couple of articles. In 2012, there was a Swedish article. They took 48 patients, they gave them 5 lectures. If you remember, Sweden has moved on to a general recommendation of a high-fat, low-carb diet. Of the 48 patients, about 48% stuck to the LCHF diet, and they found that there was a better better maintenance of blood glucose and total.
This is how old were they?
So this is the crunch, which the mean age was 52 plus minus 11 years. So this is a problem for studies in children, but it's one of the few studies that there are of an LCHF diet in diabetes type 1. But we see here that the before and after the diet, that there's a lower variability in blood glucose, and the HbA1c, the A is the mean, B is people who, the 52% that went off the diet, and the people who maintain that diet are graph number D. The pioneer of this low-carb diet in diabetes type 1 is Dr. Richard Bernstein, and his story is extremely fascinating. He was born in 1934. In 1946, at the age of 12, he was diagnosed as type 1 diabetes, and he went on to the prudent diet, the ADA, the American Diabetes Association recommendations, and he found that he was having a lot of trouble maintaining control. In 1969, he saw an advert for a blood glucose monitor. Now this was being marketed to police stations, because when you see someone unconscious in the road, you'd like to know, is he dead drunk or is he hypoglycemic? So they were selling it for $650. He bought one of these, and he was basically the first person to self-monitor his blood glucose levels. And by trial and error, he came to this idea that a low-carb, high-fat diet would give him much better control. He wrote articles to medical journals, and they were all rejected because he wasn't a doctor. So in 1977, at the age of 45, he enters a medical school and he becomes a doctor. 1983, hangs out his shingle, he opens up his endocrinology practice, and at the age of 81, he's still practicing.
Where is he?
He's in Maramnet, New York. Now, I'd like to paraphrase Simon and Garfunkel, that, if you may remember, the words of the prophet are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. And in our age of social media and the internet and the democratization of information, we can now say that the words of the prophets are written on the Facebook walls and YouTube halls. And in Israel, here in the Holy Land, we know all about prophets and Bibles, and for many, many people, Dr. Richard Bernstein is the prophet, and this is his Bible. He's written the Diabetes Solution, and he has a channel called the Diabetes University, and this has been watched by hundreds of thousands to millions of hits on his sites.
That's a good point, and I seem to slip over it, but it's the reason that I initially invented blood sugar self-monitoring. I was disturbing my family and even my employers by my frequent hypoglycemia, which was several times a day. I'd be, at the very least, irritable and acting crazy. And this is not a way to live, and it's not the thing you want to impose on those around you. So my main goal was to eliminate the hypoglycemia, and I found I could only do that by keeping my blood sugars level, which I could only do with a low carbohydrate diet and what we call physiologic doses of insulin. The industrial doses of insulin advocated by the American Diabetes Association to cover their high carbohydrate diets are not reproducible in terms of their effect on blood sugar. They're not absorbed in a predictable way, and so on. So you're playing with fire when you use high carbohydrate and these industrial doses of insulin.
Or impossible to predict the rise in blood glucose. The absorption of subcutaneous insulin is also variable, also may have up to a 10% discrepancy, so it's very difficult to time the high of the insulin. And so he advocates small changes in blood glucose by this high-fat, low-carb diet, which requires small adjustments of insulin, and he has found that this can maintain normal blood glucose and HbA1c levels. So a word about HbA1c levels. I'm sure you all know that the lower the HbA1c levels in diabetics, the lower the complications of myocardial infarcts. This is, I think, mainly geared to type 2. There's a 14% decrease per 1% decrease in HbA1c. In microvascular endpoints, there's a decrease of 37% for each 1% reduction in HbA1c. And the savings to the medical community is up to $4,000 for each 1% drop in HbA1c. So you may well ask, what about hypoglycemia? And we all know what hypoglycemia does to us. And but the question is, have you ever studied this in keto-adapted patients? So keto adaptation is a state of metabolic adaptation to ketones using as a fuel source in carbohydrate-restricted diets. Now, when we talk about ketogenic diets, we know all about ketogenic diets because it's used in epilepsy, and in scouring the internet, I found one paper which in epilepsy in 2010 by Dressler, which were a report of 2 case reports, 2 children, 6 months old and 3 years old, who were put on a ketogenic diet for epilepsy. They did manage to control the epilepsy, and they found that the diabetes was also well controlled, and it decreased the HbA1c, and they concluded that a low-carb, high-fat diet or a ketogenic diet was safe and efficacious in the treatment of these epileptic people without a problem with their diabetes. Now, the person's really studied this, and one of the big names in ketogenic diets, in nutritional ketosis, is Jeff Volek. He's now in the University of Ohio. He was previously in the University of Connecticut. And what he has to say about diabetics, or what may be implied with diabetics, is very interesting. I thought that you may be interested in this.
The truth is, ketones are a natural part of human metabolism, incredibly important aspect from an evolutionary perspective in terms of providing a fuel source for the brain during periods of prolonged starvation. Basically allowed us as Homo sapiens to develop big brains, which is probably the most unique aspect of our species. So that when I talk about ketones, I'm referring to beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. They're produced in the liver when carbohydrates are limited. And one of the most important functions of ketones is to provide fuel for the brain. So in a normal fed state, the brain is a glucose-dependent organ, getting almost exclusively all its energy from carbohydrate or glucose. But in ketosis, more than half of the energy, perhaps up to 2/3 or 3/4 of the energy the brain needs comes from ketones. So this is really important effect because now you have a very stable and sustainable fuel source for the brain. Keto adaptation then, as I talked about, is really this process of adapting to a low carbohydrate diet, which we've learned does take time. It takes a couple weeks or even months for all these adaptations to occur. And this is a fascinating study that I just wanted to show because it's a study you probably won't see replicated because of IRBs. But this was a study done by George Cahill, who did a lot of the elegant experiments on ketosis. He took a group of people who had been starved for 4 weeks. And you can see they had very high ketone levels here, around 5 millimolar. And then infused insulin into these people, such that their fasting blood sugar levels, which were normal, 70 milligrams per deciliter, plummeted to levels, in some cases they reported, below 20 milligrams per deciliter. The body doesn't tolerate that level of hypoglycemia unless you have ketones around. So these people who had this level of glucose showed absolutely no signs or symptoms of low blood sugar. They were perfectly fine.
So the hypothesis is that if you take people with a high carb, low fat diet, their insulin and needs are high swings of glucose, we put them on a low carb, high fat diet. There's a 2 to 4 week adaptation period, and the theory is, or the theorem, that lowers the glucose peaks, it lowers the insulin needs, they have a certain protection from hypoglycemia, they lower the HbA1c, and the end organ complications are lower. Now, you may well ask, what about growth? Well, Dr. Bernstein addresses this to his followers, and he says, give more protein.
There are crude formulas for calculating the amount of protein to give a person, but they're very, very crude, and you have to really play by trial and error. For example, we say that a 140-pound person who is sedentary, for a sedentary person, 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight is a starting point. And if they gain too much weight, or if it's too much for them to eat, you cut back. If they don't gain weight, you add to it. If you have someone who's underweight and you want to put on weight, you would give more than that. If you have a child who's growing, you might have 2 or 3 or 4 times, or maybe even 5 times that amount.
So what he's saying is that a high protein diet will ensure growth.
What about the kidney?
So studies have shown that high protein in normal kidneys do not affect. In kidney failure or in problems, there are problems with high protein, but I have studies which have shown that a high protein diet in normal kidneys, and people, I mean millions of people were doing the Atkins diet, very high. This is not an Atkins diet in very high protein, but they found that it was well tolerated. Now, who do concerned parents turn to, because they're having a problem turning to their endocrinologists? So this is one Facebook page called Type 1 Grit, and if you see here, it has 913 people who are diabetic type 1s who are on this diet, and they are maintaining low HbA1cs in normal levels. There's an Israeli blog which we have here, which I spoke to the person who runs it yesterday, and he tells me that he has tens of people who are following this diet, and he has a blog with them. And this is one of the postings that I picked up on the Facebook page of Type 1 Grit. And it says, because of grit, I was able to enjoy a day at the beach without any high or low blood sugars. Before, I would run into the 200s the whole time for fear of going low in the water. And eating Dr. B's way puts me in control. So grateful that I saw the light. Now, whether one agrees with this or not, they are putting out onto the internet for all people to see, and all diabetics who are drawn to this, like bees to honey, this promise that you can maintain a normal HbA1c with normal levels of glucose. One of the things that I took off their website was this study by Bonfig, which showed that normal HbA1cs will give good growth levels, and the worse the HbA1c is, the more out of range, the less their final growth potential will be. And they brought this up as a proof that Dr. Bernstein's kids here, says Dr. B's group, kids do not need carbs for growth. They need normal blood sugar and virtually unlimited protein. Now, I myself actually downloaded and read this actual article, and at no time in this entire article did they actually mention diet at all. They talked about tighter control of insulin and the development of faster-acting insulins. So this begs further research. And in fact, I did beg to do further research. David and I wanted to put together a questionnaire which we would give them, and basically it was rejected by the administrators in favor of people who are already plugged into them and have funding for this. And in his final word to me, the administrator wrote, "While in principle I agree with you below," and that the principle of the fact that I said that what you need is as many studies as possible to show safety and efficacy. So while in principle I agree with you, I also remember some wisdom I got from Dr. Feynman, who said that in response to an endocrinologist who claimed that there are no long-term studies on low carbohydrate diets and diabetes, Feynman said, "Well, let me ask you this. Suppose for some reason your patient had gone on a low-carb diet since their last appointment, improved various markers, including their H1C, would you tell them to stop?" So in conclusion, what I would like to just throw out here is that there's a groundswell grassroots movement towards a low-carb, high-fat diet as a viable part of diabetes type 1 management. And the question is there any validity in the theory that this diet can play a part in diabetes type 1? And what we need are adequate studies of safety and efficacy, which are not available at present. And is there a basis for further research? And that's what I've come here to ask you. So, thank you very much.